Thank you, Lance. I'd like to thank Darren Begbie and John Walsh very much for the invitation and the extraordinary courtesy and way in which we've been greeted in New Zealand and the wonderful accommodation that we have. So thank you very much. My talk is really going to be about trying to show you what it is like to practice in a country like South Africa as an architect and the kind of challenges that we face, because I imagine they're probably very different from what most people would find anywhere else in the world. So I'll start off by talking to you about our practice and to try and describe to you what it is that, I've got to go back. What it is that we think is important in the work that we do. I run a very small practice. I have myself and 6 young architects who work with me. The oldest architect other than myself in the office is 30 years younger than me, which I think is great, which means I'm surrounded by young people, most of whom I've taught at the University of Cape Town, and it's made my life much more enjoyable. The statements that you see written up there are statements that I think are important for us, and we've reached those statements to guide us through the work that we do in South Africa, not because we want to be clever, not because we want to be to promote our work, but just that working in a country like South Africa, which has undergone massive transformation since 1994, we have to keep very carefully in mind the kind of work that we do and who we work for, because there are lots of temptations, and we have a huge set of challenges that we have to address in the country. And like Sadie said in her previous speech, there's a huge role for architects to play, although I would have only one single quibble with what she said, and that is, I don't believe as architects we're problem solvers. That's what we leave to engineers. As architects, we have to make very difficult decisions in circumstances where there's no clear outcome as to whether we're right or wrong. And I think that's what marks, the discrimination that marks a very good architect or designer. But we believe that architecture is brought into being in order to satisfy purpose, and by purpose we make a very strong distinction between purpose and program. Program seems to be used a lot by developers and architects today. It's like taking a whole lot of space and bulking it up into so many 100,000 square feet or square meters of administrative, and then another 100,000 of theatrical space, whatever, and then you lump the two together, and that's what I think people now today seem to think of what is purpose. I think our idea of purpose is really to do with the use to which space is put and to try and find poetry in trying to give expression to that use. I think we have to be guided in the work we do in the world, the work we do in the world that we live in today, especially because of rapid change and huge rising issues of inequality. And I think ethics should play a very large part in what we do. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be one single architectural profession in the world which actually has a clear position on ethics, other than that we don't badmouth each other or that we act in a contractual sense. But I think that we've taken our idea of ethics from the work of Ludwig Wittgenstein, a great 20th century philosopher, who said that ethics is the inquiry into what is valuable or into what is important, into the meaning of life, into what makes life worth living, the right way of living. I think that's for us very important. So we strive to achieve those kinds of ends in the work that we make. The other thing, the question that architecture must be beautiful, and I think that that's absolutely right, and we are like artists. We strive to achieve the same ends that artists make, but one important distinction needs to be borne in mind in the work we do, which I think was very clearly articulated very beautifully in the previous lecture by Sadie, is that we do it on behalf of other people. They pay us huge sums of money to do something that's not for us but for them. And this puts us in a unique position as artists, if we want to call ourselves artists. And I think we don't recognize that enough in the work that we do. So these claims for architecture as an autonomous form, the idea of form for, making form simply for form's sake without any consideration for the people who are going to be using the spaces is fundamentally wrong for us, and we need to find ways of correcting that. The image that you see on the left is from Mozambique, and it's a very poor country, an absolutely extraordinary country. We call it the Brazil of Africa. But it's really about the role that the architect plays in Africa, or certainly in Southern Africa, which is that although the architect is impoverished in the sense that there's not a lot of money available to either pay the architect or to pay for the buildings that the architects make, there's still a dignity attached to that work. And I think it's beautifully captured in that little maquette that you see on the left-hand side, which we have a whole collection of them in our office. The other engagement that we have in the work that we do is really an engagement with the everyday, and I think the everyday forms really our work. And why I stress this is that in a country like South Africa, which has undergone a number of changes over its certainly post-colonial period of 350, 400 years, a number of great changes, we have a very unstable cultural idea of who we are as a country. And I think that that instability persists today despite the great strides that were made after 1994. So in a sense for us, the way in which we look for meaning in the work that we do, we look for meaning in the everyday lives that we see that are acted out in the world that we live in. And we use that as a basis for making the architecture that we do. And I think that, this might be that the work is banal. It might be very ordinary. It might be all those kinds of things. For us, it's not important. It's that sense of understanding the world that we live in, what surrounds us in our everyday lives, and then opening that up to examination and then using that as a basis for moving forward with the architecture that we make. I think in art, as Christopher Hawthorne was said earlier today, is a fantastic way of looking into the way in which a society thinks of itself. And I think these are two very interesting paintings. The one on the left was made by a very well-known black artist from Johannesburg called Sydney Nkhumalo, and he made it in the 1980s. And it really represented an idea of what South Africa thought of itself pre-liberation in 1994, during the apartheid years, which is that we were completely cut off from Africa because of apartheid and the boycotts. And so we saw ourselves as a small country on the tip of Africa, on the southern tip of Africa, and the rest of Africa was a black field, something that we didn't know anything about. We weren't connected to it at all. And that was really shaped a large sense of who we thought of ourselves as a beleaguered nation on the the southern tip of Africa. The artwork on the right-hand side is by a fantastic artist from Namibia, and it touches on, for me, what is also a very important distinction that I think you need to make when you think about South Africa and the kind of work that we do in South Africa as artists. In black African languages, there's no word to describe the idea of the beautiful as a disinterested property. Something is not beautiful just for the sake of being beautiful. Something can only be beautiful if it's useful. So a bed which is comfortable to sleep in is a beautiful bed. But it cannot be a beautiful thing which has no purpose attached to it. And that, for me, is always a wonderfully powerful reminder of what it is that we do as architects. And John Mafengejo's work is part of the tradition of storytelling in South Africa through art. And it's an art that tells the political history of Namibia through a series of silkscreen prints and other kinds of prints that he made during his very short life. And that's also a very good reminder for us. The worlds that we live in South Africa are incredibly diverse, from the barely painted architecture to the grand colonial work of people like Herbert Baker and Edwin Lutyens, who came out to South Africa to spread the good word of the British Empire and built these huge big buildings, which are in themselves quite beautiful, but at the same time have a huge symbolic weight. And it's interesting that our current government now sits at the Union Buildings, which is at the bottom of the slide, and the building has been transformed from a symbol of oppression to one of liberation. So it's a useful idea to think of when we think about architecture, that building form and its reading culturally and symbolically is very much dependent upon human agency, and that can change in a moment in time. So to blame architects for designing buildings that become used by oppressive regimes in future states is not fair at all, because we have no control over that. The Johannesburg is the largest industrial complex in the African continent, and we have a huge history of industrial buildings that started off with the gold mining industry in the turn of the 20th century, and a lot of art represents that. We have this curious collision between modern architecture, which you can see in Johannesburg on the left-hand side, and the way in which the informal life of people in our city, the everyday life in our city, engages with that modernity in the slide on the right-hand side, where under one of our elevated highways on the eastern side of Johannesburg, we have a very, very large market called the Mai Market. And the highway makes a fantastic canopy under which the market can exist. South Africa is the most urbanized country in Africa. 65% of our population is urbanized, which is very, very different from anywhere else in Africa. It's very good politically for us because it means that we have a very astute and sophisticated urban population who are able to make good political choices, which is the reason why our current government was caught short in their corruption and were brought to heel, and we now have a new president, Cyril Ramaphosa, who's leading the country. But the vast majority of the people who live in our country live in informal settlements, shack settlements like you can see on the left over there. And that in turn has spawned a whole art that grows from that, as you can see in the other slide, which I think has had an unfortunate effect on architecture because it's what we refer to in South Africa as radical shack chic, which has become now a kind of expression that wealthy people want to pay for in terms of architecture. The resourcefulness of people, I suppose it's anywhere in the world, but for me, because I'm South African, I believe it lies in South Africa, is absolutely astounding. What you see on the top there is a bicycle, or it's a kind of machine that people can either ride or they can carry goods in, and it's made entirely out of wood, including wooden wheels. And it has springs that have been cannibalized off old tractors, and it's used by people to carry market produce kilometers away. On the bottom is an image of two kids living in the path of the jumbo jets that take off and land at Cape Town International Airport, and they built a scaled working model out of flattened cans of one of those aircraft. And you know, I'd love to get my hands as a teacher on these kinds of kids and give them an opportunity to become architects, because I think they show unbelievable talent. I dare any one of you in this place, no matter how greatly you might think of your skills, to be able to do something like that. The city I live in is Cape Town. It's a city that is very different from anywhere else in Africa. Many people come there and they don't believe they're in Africa. It was discovered, the Dutch claim they discovered it, but then the Dutch claim a whole lot of things that are not true. It was actually discovered by the Portuguese, but the Portuguese weren't smart enough to claim it as their land, and so the Dutch came along and they created a settlement there in the mid-17th century. But when the Dutch arrived in the Cape, the only indigenous people who lived in the Cape were the Khoisan people, who were the original inhabitants of that part of the world. Their culture goes back 6,000 to 7,000 years in that part of Cape Town, of the Cape Province. And they were decimated by disease and also by the rapacious demands of the early Dutch colonial powers. And so the early Dutch settlers imported slaves to the Western Cape, to Cape Town, to work in the farms and the burgeoning settlement. And so today Cape Town is, or the Cape metropolitan region, is a place that is largely colored. We call colored in South Africa, by that we mean people of mixed race, and most of them are Muslim, and most of them are descended from slaves. So when people come to Cape Town, they don't feel they're in Africa because they're surrounded by people who don't look African. And it's quite a kind of interesting anomaly. That's changing now because of the freedom that's been offered by the lifting of racial movement in South Africa. And a lot of black African people from the Eastern Cape are moving to Cape Town, but it's still a very different kind of place. It's quite exquisite. I mean, I think your country is beautiful, but I don't think you've got a landscape like we've got in Cape Town, quite honestly. But this is we can talk about that later. But it's a large city. It's 4.5 million people, which I think is equivalent to the total population of New Zealand. But because of the nature of the landscape, it's broken up into smaller settlements. So we have the biggest part of Cape Town is the central business district, which accommodates about 500,000 people. And then the city spreads itself around the peninsula into smaller settlements. So it's a big city that doesn't look like a big city, and it's quite a special place to live in. I think one of the interesting ways of looking at how cities grow over time is to look at the way in which the city has been represented through its history. Interesting enough, Cape Town was settled by the Dutch at the same time that New York was settled, so it's as old as New York City. But we had a wonderful landscape. New York had to build its landscape. It had to build it through buildings. But the early Dutch sailors who came to Cape Town would return to Holland, and they would, in words, describe to artists or cartographers what they'd seen in Cape Town. And so you get these hugely exaggerated drawings of what the mountainscape in Cape Town was like. But that's very interesting because you have the imagination acting on memory, and then you have a second person translating that into something that exists in time and becomes a historic document. Of course, the power of the white colonial culture became predominant, and we have now the rainbow, which is really the rainbow of entry into Africa. You enter under the rainbow, and there you've got a clear path all the way to the Nile. And that's what the vision of people like Cecil John Rhodes was. The adverts, I don't know, Pepsi Cola, Peter Stuyvesant or whatever. And then this other very strange thing that happened with the Dutch, which is that in 1952, to celebrate, I think, the 400th anniversary of Jan van Riebeck's arrival in the Cape, they actually built a faux townscape of Utrecht, which is where he came from, and they brought from Holland bricks to build these buildings. They put them up, and a year later they pulled them down. The modernist vision of Africa, this was done by a very wonderful modernist architect who subsequently emigrated to Israel. This was an idea of what Cape Town could be like in the future with the grand super blocks that would step back towards the mountain and form an axis all the way again to the Nile. What Cape Town could be like, and then what it is now. It's a city for rent. You can come to Cape Town, you can rent a room, you can get a really good meal, you could get a woman, you can get a man, you can get whatever it is that you want. It's not too expensive. People are flooding there, and they love it. And we're very upset about it, because as you can see, what we have is our city, everything is up for sale, and the people who service the needs of those tourists live in the foreground of this photograph here in tin shacks far away from the action. So tourism, I think, carries with it a certain kind of weight and responsibility. And I think we're now reconsidering our view of international tourism, because we're taking the view that it's doing more harm than good in our city. This is just a diagram that was part of a research project we did, but it shows how our city in Cape Town works, but how all our South African cities work. It's about wealth density and energy consumption. As you can see, the smallest number of people have the greatest amount of wealth, and they consume the greatest amount of energy, which is a real problem we have in our country about income inequality, and it's also largely determined by race. The first set of buildings I want to show you are some churches that I made, and I think my life has been kind of really very fortunate in the sense that I studied in England for a couple of years, and I was given a contact of a young archdeacon at the cathedral in Johannesburg. His name was Desmond Tutu. So when I returned to South Africa in 1982 or 3, I went to see him. And he'd just been made then Bishop of Johannesburg, and he had fired the old, rather elderly diocesan architect, and he was looking for a new diocesan architect. I happened to meet him at the time when he wanted to appoint someone, and he looked at me and he asked me about what I was doing, and I told him I was an architect. He said, "I want you." And I said, "Look, I'm white, I'm Catholic, I'm not Anglican, I'm a Marxist-Leninist, and I've never done a church in my life. And he laughed in his characteristic way and said, "You're perfect." And it was really an incredible opportunity for me. So for 10 years, I worked as diocesan architect for the Anglican Church, only in black areas, in Soweto and other townships around Johannesburg. And designing really, we did about probably 40, 50 churches, but tiny little buildings, little tin churches in the middle of nowhere that cost next to nothing. And it taught me so many lessons. But the first project I did was a tiny little chapel for Desmond, which was in the backyard of his house in Soweto, and it was a tiny little chapel. It was 2 meters wide, and he's a deeply religious man, and he is guided by hours of contemplation, which happen in the early morning, so he needed a quiet space that would be separate from everything else. And these are some images of this little building that we made for him. So it was my first commission, was in fact to design a chapel for, can you believe it, a Nobel Peace Prize winner. I didn't know that then. But when he won the Nobel Peace Prize, he took a lot of the money that he had been given, and we embarked on a large rural church building project, which he paid for from his prize money. And what we did was take typical farm sheds that you would find in rural areas, clad them with concrete, and to give distinction to each church, we would treat the facade, the front facade of the church, with a solid material, either a brick or a concrete block, and give it a distinctive design. So we went through a whole process of these churches, and what we did as the architect is we would make little wooden plaques that would show the design of the facade of the church, and we'd give it to the church on the day of commemoration. The interior of those churches. And then other churches, a circular church I did for Desmond in Soweto, which I won't explain to you, but it was a very interesting church because it was a place where ambassadors and other people would come for church services on Sunday mornings to meet the political leadership in Soweto. So it was a very important element. You can't underestimate the role that the churches and the trade unions played in liberating South Africa. People talk about the ANC in exile. I don't think so. I think we were liberated through the force and power of people like Desmond Tutu and others, through the churches, and then our trade union movement. And the interiors. These are churches that we didn't employ builders. We got the materials from a local building supply company, and we employed local artisans on a labor-only basis to construct. So this was an attempt to make a very proper church, which was actually just a tin shed behind with a formal front. And they wanted a colonnade on the front, and we even designed a capital to suit. What was, again, one of the advantages of teaching is that you sometimes teach some remarkable people. One of the best students I've ever come across in my life was a young student called Gavin Millard when I taught at Wits in the 1980s. And when he graduated, he won every prize that there was on show. And then 2 years later, he came to see me and he told me that he was going to become an Anglican priest and he was going to join the church. And he asked me for my advice, and I said to him, you can't be a priest and an architect. They're both incredibly difficult things to do. So he chose to become a priest, but when he left me, he said that one day he and I would build a church. And he moved to Cape Town, and 3 or 4 years later, he called me up and said, now we're going to build a church. So this is a small church that we're now completing in Cape Town that had its genesis in Johannesburg 30 years ago. And we don't build churches in South Africa anymore because most of the mainstream churches have lost followers, and we have this thing called prosperity religion, where you have these incredibly charismatic people who promise people that they will become rich if they will believe in God and give them money. And they don't build churches, they build gigantic big factory buildings and then fill it up on the inside with very expensive musical sound equipment, and people get swept away and give all their money to these people who become very rich. There's a preacher in Nigeria, in Abuja, who is reputed to attract up to 1 million people at his services. So you can imagine what that would mean in terms of space. but the interior of the church. So that's one part of the work we do, and we're still doing it now. The other part is to do with remaking the city. And for you to understand that South African cities are, they were decimated. They were decimated through the application of modern town planning ideas, which dealt with the strict segregation of uses, the 4 segments as from Le Corbusier and from Siam. But then if you can imagine that kind of inefficient model being overlaid by spatial segregation that came through apartheid, where black people were spatially agglomerated and separated from whites and coloreds and Indians and so on. So in 1994, there was a certain kind of madness that gripped our country, because we thought, okay, we're liberated, all our problems will disappear, and we'll live in a great non-racial democracy. And it took 5 years for us to realize that there was a huge amount of work that still lay ahead of us in reshaping our cities to make them work better. I don't think we've moved along very far on that route, because our government has taken a very short-term measure of what to do about the city. So they spent a lot of money on building lots of houses. They've built almost 4 million houses over the last 25 years, which is a huge achievement. The houses that they build, by the way, are given to people for free. Little house on a piece of ground, if you qualify because you earn below a certain income, you get a free house. But these houses have not been used in any significant way to find ways of dealing with the problems of the city. They're all being built on large pieces of agricultural land, outskirts of the city, far from work opportunity with huge transport costs. So if anything, our government's housing policy has exacerbated the problem of the apartheid city, not improved it. So we've been involved in a series of projects that have been trying to deal with these things. The first one is a project that I won in competition in the late 90s for the Red Location Cultural Precinct in Port Elizabeth. And it was a very brave project. It's in a township called New Brighton. It was a very poor area. It was effectively what we would call a shack settlement. It was series of dilapidated houses. And the city of Port Elizabeth decided that what they wanted to do was they wanted to create a cultural center for the city, which it didn't have, but they wanted to do that right in the middle of a township, in the middle of a shack settlement, which I thought was a really great idea. And I think if we want to talk about transforming our cities, that's what we have to do. We have this idea that we have to bring poor people into the city. But what we're saying in South Africa is let's bring the city to poor people in the worlds that they live in. So we're involved in this project. It started off as a crossroad, which is, I think, how all cities start off. The competition drawings where we made a cross on the ground, and then we placed the important public buildings on each of the 4 corners. This is the context within which we had to work. It was dire. A drawing of our proposal for what it was that we wanted to do, which was to create a museum of struggle, an art gallery, a library, some theaters, and then housing. So it was an integrated urban model where people would live next door to the museum, next door to the library. The plan that we developed over quite a long period of time in consultation with local people landed up as this plan here with 240 odd houses and the crossroads still intact. And then what I did is I got invited by David Chipperfield to exhibit at the 2012, I think, or 2014 Venice Biennale. And so I then embarked on a project of monumental silliness, which was to draw this whole project at a 1 in 100 scale and make a drawing that was 9 meters long by 4 meters high. And it took me 6 months of, mind-numbing madness. But what was interesting about how I drew the drawing was to draw the buildings on the ground first, and then thinking about how people occupy space in the city as a series of layers. And it's a series of layers of use. What I then did is I layered the drawings in that way. So you have, first of all, the buildings. Then you have the movement of people as we would have imagined they would have moved through the spaces that we created on the site, as eddies. I think all of you know that very famous drawing that Louis Kahn made of Philadelphia with the traffic and the major transport streams and the minor transport streams, and layered that then with cars, with landscape, and then finally with the final layer which we put on top of that was the occupation of each space on that huge big plan, where the furniture was placed in each room, each space, in that entire plan, as a kind of vindication, in a sense, to ourselves that we were doing the right thing. Now, I must say that I don't believe in urban design because I don't think that we can predict the future, and I think that architecture, modern architecture's biggest problem has been about trying to predict the future, and every future we've ever predicted has been an abysmal failure. So, in a sense, I contradict myself by doing this, but this is, after all, only a drawing, and we didn't really ever want to get it built like this. So please, don't take that seriously. And then the final drawing, which then went to the Biennale. We were looking at trying to find ways of how to give cultural expression to buildings in a context in which no public buildings had ever been built, because the townships that people lived in were simply dormitory towns with no public buildings whatsoever. And so I went back and looked at the artwork that was produced, particularly the protest artwork that was produced during the period, and what I uncovered, which I think was quite interesting, was that the sawtooth factory roof was a very important building type that was constantly referenced in almost all the work that I saw. And if I can explain to you why I think it happened because we underestimate the power that the trade unions had in bringing down South Africa. And interestingly enough, when you talk to workers in a city like Port Elizabeth, which is the Detroit of Africa, we produce all the motor cars in Africa in Port Elizabeth, many of them had the view that the workplace, the factory, the sawtooth roof, symbolized civic virtue in as much as it was the place where they fought and succeeded in freeing the country. So it had this huge association in people's minds. And it was a shot in the dark, but we thought, well, if that's the case, then why don't we use the sawtooth roof as a kind of formal measure and develop a series of buildings using that in different ways? And that's what we did. So the first building we did was a museum, and what we did is develop a series of memory boxes, no linear historical narrative. I don't believe in history. History's bunk. I think we have to recreate history through memories, and I think that's what museums should do. So we tried to do that through 12 large muted memory boxes that were placed. It's a drawing that I made for the competition, but these memory boxes are 12 meters tall, 6 meters by 6 meters, and they contained inside of each one of them exhibitions that dealt with things that were quite unusual at that time. The role of women and children in struggle, the role of gay people in the struggle for freedom in South Africa, and stuff like that. And then we placed them inside of this huge, big hangar-like space. And that was the building that resulted. This is a view of the entrance to the building, some of the elevations that I drew up, a wonderful cinema screen that we built. My wife is a film publicist, and at the time, I don't know if any of you remember seeing Tsotsi. It had won the Best Foreign Film award at the Oscars and was touring South Africa, and we wanted to find a place to premiere it in Red location. So we wanted to build this gigantic big cinema screen, but the mayor wasn't interested in funding it until I told him that it could also be used as a place for him to hold political rallies, and that he could project onto the screen images of all the good work he was doing in Port Elizabeth. And like a sucker, he said, let's go ahead and build it. And we did it in about 2 months. And then the sense of those tall spaces that you enter that are very strange and very mute. There's no description on the outside of the boxes as to what is happening inside the boxes. You discover it for yourself. And then the next buildings we did were an art gallery and a library, and this is as far as we've got at the moment. But again, I think taking the idea of purpose, what we tried here was to create an archive of struggle material from the history of, sorry, I just want to go there. That is an archive with an archive reading room where we got two universities to move their archive material dealing with struggle to these spaces. And we had a set of spaces here for school kids to use. We had a digital library here. So you actually had university professors and students rubbing shoulders with township kids in the same space. And for us, that represented a form of transformation. The museum, not the museum, the archive building. What happened was this timber cladding that you see here, the Volkswagen and Toyota factories are just around the corner from the site, and their equipment, or the parts that they assemble their cars from, come in big wooden boxes, and those wooden boxes are then dumped. And what local people do is they then recycle that and use that to build homes for themselves. And we've even got a settlement area near where the library is, which is called New Tokyo, which is a reference to the source from which the material came. So what we did with that idea of the everyday, used the packing case architecture to clad our building. And that kind of familiarity, I think, provided people with a great deal of comfort, because it was something that they knew and understood rather than something that came out of who knows where. And the other question, of course, is that I think I'm a South African, so you must please understand, when I say I don't believe in something, I'm not saying you're wrong and I'm right. I'm just saying, for me as a South African, I don't believe in public space. I don't believe in creating parks in our cities, because the evidence I have in front of me is the most vital spaces we have in our country are streets. And streets are the public spaces of our cities. And the thing that we need to do as architects in South Africa, not anywhere else, please, I'm not suggesting, is that we have to animate those edges that sit adjacent to the street so that they can be used by people usefully. So as you can see in a situation like this, where we have a library building, we build seats into it. And in fact, we've encouraged people to scroll graffiti on those blue walls, and we're keeping them as they are. And at the moment, they look beautiful. They're really rich. And this is an absolutely wonderful tapestry that I put on display with the big drawing that I made at the Venice Biennale, which is a reworking, if you can believe it, of Picasso's Guernica, the famous painting he did. It's exactly the same size as Guernica. It's 9 meters long by 3.5 meters high. But it's made by a local group of women who wanted to take the idea of the Guernica drawing, or the Guernica painting, but to adjust it in their own way, to not represent what happened at Guernica, but to represent what had happened in their own lives with regard to the AIDS epidemic. So you can see there have been adjustments made all the way through with images of women suffering over here. But what is really poignant is these little metal plaques at the bottom there, which are inscribed, each one of them is inscribed with the name of a woman, her date of birth and her date of death, who died from AIDS. So it's a very powerful testament to both the AIDS epidemic and our government's reluctance at that time to deal with the epidemic. And then the spaces inside, and this, I think, very nice timber library on the inside. And I think what for me is important to say to you is that this is built in a shack settlement. This is, and we've made no concession. I mean, these are cheaply built buildings, but we've made no concession to the fact that it's being built there. We've tried to build it in the best possible way we can, because we believe everyone deserves decent architecture. The art gallery, again, the idea of dealing with the facade of the building as a place where people can sit. And with the streets that we made the street and the sidewalk all one material. And we had the view that the cars should stop for people and they should treat them with respect, which is what happens. Dogs are even safe on these streets, if you can believe it. And the art gallery is built around an old shack, which is over 100 years old. and it's the last remaining shack there. It's now been declared a national monument, and we're leaving it as it is, and we're not trying to rebuild it. We've just left it as it is, and as it creaks and it grows ever more unstable, we get local people to come in to stuff it with packets of plastic or whatever it is that they've done in the past, and we'll keep it like that as a living monument. And one day it'll collapse, and when it collapses, we'll decide what we're going to do with it. And this art gallery, which lights up at nighttime, and then the spaces on the inside, and the idea that it's an art gallery where you can look into it from the outside, so you can see what's happening inside the art gallery from the outside. And then a range of houses that we that we're building, which are 4.5 meters wide. They're tiny houses, they're 40 square meter houses, which is all we can afford to build on a government subsidy. But what we were keen to do was to speculate about how we could make the houses and how they might grow over time. So it was only a speculation, it wasn't an urban design project. We weren't trying to suggest that's what would happen. We just wanted to imagine what could happen. But what we did was we created allotments in the middle, which came through discussion with local people, and those allotments would then be used to generate food for families who lived around it. And this was our idea. The other thing was that, if I could just say to you, it's quite interesting. The existing government houses are little boxes that are built and placed in the middle of the site. These houses, the local people wanted us to build them as terraces and forming a strong wall against the street. So you couldn't see into the backyard, because when people move into these houses, they have to leave their shacks behind. The government doesn't allow them to bring the shack onto the property. And these people wanted to do it. So what we did is we engaged in a bit of subterfuge. By building terrace walls, we would actually allow people to build their shacks behind, and the government officials driving past couldn't see that happening. And what people do quite smartly is they use the shacks as for rental purposes. So it's a house as a form of income generation. And that's the housing that we made. Where we live in Cape Town is in a place called Hout Bay, and this is a low-income settlement over here, and we live adjacent to it. It's quite interesting. This is called the Village, and we live on the heights. So it's a nice distinction that's drawn by people. But this was quite interesting because we wanted to look at how it is that we could improve an existing shack settlement without having to knock it down, because the shacks are built informally with no order to them at all. So when governments move in to try and bring services into the shacks, between 40 and 50% of the shacks have got to be demolished in order to get service lines in. And we thought, why should that have to happen? And then we hit on this idea that the one service that is very easy to provide in a shack settlement is electricity, because it's provided on poles that are sunk into the ground, and then the lines are above the shacks, which means that you've got only one small point of connection into the ground, which I think is quite a smart way of getting a service in. So what we did is then we said, well, rather than plant trees, which everyone seems to want to do in townships, but the goats eat the trees before they've reached maturity, why don't we build artificial trees and bring those trees down at one single point, use the top of what we call the tree machine to collect water. We could grow stuff on it, and then we could collect water at another place, clean it, and bring it back here, and so that this could be a social point. So we planted trees, but we planted tree machines. And we worked out a whole system of how to do this. This was very interesting because we did this at the invitation of the Maxi Museum in Italy, and they paid us to do this research. So we would have never been able to afford to do it otherwise, but we're hoping to build it now. And then we made a series of drawings to just look at what the quality of those spaces might be like. And I think you can see that these tree machines can in fact become the canopies of trees, and they can do all sorts of wonderful jobs to help people live better lives. And the tree planting exercise and then a proposal to build a couple of them in the city. This is not a photograph, it's a render, but the city of Cape Town hasn't bitten yet, but we'll persist. in Johannesburg, a number of projects that we've worked on. One which is we did in 1994 at the time of change, which is to build some housing in the city for city workers and bank city families. But we were concerned about how to make safe spaces for people in the middle of the city, because Johannesburg is quite a rough, tough city. And so we created a ground plane, which we called a democratic plane, which we said is given over to the city, and created a new ground plane one level above that, and wrapped the housing around it with family housing opening directly onto the courtyard and young people's housing in lofts above that. It never got very far, but then just recently we've been involved in another project which is for a wonderful development called Mabaneng in Johannesburg, which is in the old part of Johannesburg, the industrial part, eastern part of the city. And what's interesting about this part of the city is that the land values here the land has no value here at all. It's abandoned land. People have either come to New Zealand or Australia or America or whatever, left their land behind and abandoned it. And an enterprising young Johannesburg man called Jonathan Liebman, who's only 35, moved in and claimed title to all this land and is now redeveloping it for low-income housing in the middle of the city. And so we were tasked with, you can see the site we were given. It's a 30-meter by 30-meter site, and we've spent the last 3 years trying to find a way of how to build the first apartment building in downtown Johannesburg in 40 years for poor people. And it's been a real tough battle, because even though the land is being put in at no value whatsoever, to bring it in at a reasonable price is very difficult without government subsidy. And this is being done right through the private sector. So the first set of ideas were very optimistic. We wanted to have a mixed low-income housing with a penthouse at the top, with family housing on the ground and all that kind of stuff. And then gradually it just got tighter and tighter and tighter. A series of sections that we made, the plans just shrunk. I think if any of you know the history of Frankfurt housing, Ernst May and Mart Stam, they did the minimum housing, and then it just got smaller and smaller and smaller until it reached the point of collapse. And this is exactly what happened to us, because we went through a series of exercises trying to get the land more and more tight. What we landed up doing was even building a little business center on the street side of the housing so that the local people could live there. And then it got narrower and narrower until we landed up really making 15 square meter apartments for young families in the middle of the city. And I think we've reached the point now where we are actually scared about continuing, because our view is that if we have to build this, it's going to become a DOS house. It's not going to become a decent place for people to live. But what we've really tried to do is, within the market, to find out what it is that we can build at the lowest possible cost. And you can't do it. It's just not possible, even if the land comes in at no cost. So what we need is government support, state support, in order to be able to provide decent housing for people at a high density in the middle of our cities. That's the bottom line. And we're using that now to promote that. So these are just studies that we made of the building, and then the final design, which is the one that we sit with now, and we're hoping we might be able to build it, but they're asking us to make further cuts to reduce the size of the apartments, and we're refusing to do so. So I just put this project in because it's very close to my wife, Joy, who's here with me, but Joy's uncle is an extraordinary man. His name is Dennis Goldberg. And Dennis was the only white man to be sentenced with Nelson Mandela and the others at the famous treason trial. And he was separated from them after the treason trial. And Mandela and the others went to Robben Island, and Dennis went to Pretoria Central, where he lived for 17 years in solitary confinement on death row. And he's still alive, and we're building a little memorial place for him in Cape Town. And it's just a very simple little shed building where we're going to be able to tell his life story, because he's one of the heroes of our struggle. And we have a little street that we've made, which will be used by local school kids to come in and study. And at the end of the street is a place where you can barbecue food. So on weekends, we can have wonderful social occasions there. And it's very open. But what has been a fantastic experience for me is to work on a project like this with a national hero who's still alive, and to sort of share the joy with him of making something for him that he'll probably see, if he's lucky, in his own lifetime, because he has very bad lung cancer and he doesn't have a long time to live. So we're pushing as hard as we can, but it's an extraordinarily wonderful project to be able to do. And these are some images of the project. And that's an image of Dennis standing proudly in the space that's dedicated to him. This project is, I don't know how I'm doing for time. Joy? I've got time. Oh, sorry, yes. Okay. This is trying to find a way, again, of how it is that we can help poor people get decent housing. It's a project, if I can show you, if you look at these diagrams over here, this tells you about the rate of change that happens in settlements. That's approximately 18 months. And that's the kind of growth that happens. And it's informal and it's uncontrolled. So what we wanted to do is to see how we could take shacks and let them grow vertically. And one of the things that we hit on was the idea of a table house. In other words, a table, 4 legs, and a concrete slab that could be built over a shack so people could take the shack, put it on the first floor, and develop the ground. And it's not dissimilar to Logier's famous drawing of the original house. And this was the idea. But it was extraordinary how much time it took us to do, because the detail that we had to develop, I think, took a huge amount of time. We built a couple of these prototypes, and they cost 7,500 Rand, which I think in your dollars would be about $700. So for $700, you get the beginnings of a house. And you can either have independent housing or social housing. And this is the first proud homeowner. And what happened? She took her shack, she built it on the top, and what did she do on the ground floor? She used it as a place to park her car. That's what I mean by human agency. You can never predict it, so don't get upset when people use our buildings unpredictably. I'm afraid I'm running out of time, but this is a museum of fossils that we've just built, and it really has to do with how you fit buildings into a landscape. And for me, if I may be so bold as to say, the perfect museum, because this is a piece of mining sand, which means that you can build on it, you can cut into it like cake, and you enter the museum at the top, you circulate around, you drop down into big double volume, then you drop down into the basement and you exit at the bottom. So you never ever retrace your steps. And for me, that's the perfect museum. We build lots of models that we use, and these are some images of the building. It's taken a long time for the landscape to grow, but it's now becoming almost invisible so that you can hardly see it. And that's the kind of landscape in which it sits on an old phosphate mine. And through the mining operation, they uncovered a fossil find of, I think, 6 million years old, which is one of the great fossil finds of the world. And this is soon to be declared a World Heritage Site. We had to build the museum before it got declared a World Heritage Site, otherwise it would have been too expensive to build. And the buildings, the opening, the thing that I'm very proud of is that we've used a particular kind of acrylic sheeting on the top there, which was developed in South Africa for museums. This looks like a very strange photograph. It looks almost as if it's a render, but it isn't, because there's no shadow on the ground. It gives you almost no ultraviolet radiation comes through. So you get a perfect light for exhibition material, together with the fact that you get no heat gain at all. So it's a very good South African invention. And then, of course, in South Africa, we like to dance a lot. And the fossils themselves and the fossil landscape is very important, as people were discussing. It's a project we've just done for a school where the school wanted to obliterate a view of the mountain. So what we did is we made 2 banks of classrooms and planted on top so you can still see the mountain range behind, which I think was important, and the classrooms underneath that. A hotel, what we're doing in South Africa, which I think is very good, is we can't afford to pull old buildings down now, because It's too expensive, so what we do is we reuse them. So what you have here is a building that is a disused office building because it no longer works as an office building, and we're now converting it into a 600-bed hotel with hanging gardens and terraces. It's completely mad. It's a bit like a Soviet-Russian workers' holiday hotel. And the rooms are the width of the parking of the parking grid, so they're 2.3 meters wide. So you can see just what it looks like. But it's been a really interesting project to do. And what we've done is we've developed an idea, even a 2.3 meter wide room with a very high sill. We put the bed on a little pedestal, so you can go on either side of it with a bathroom behind. Now, these are super, super economic units because we want to attract the African convention trade to Cape Town. So these will be rented for about 80 New Zealand dollars a night. And then what happens, which is you build a lovely house for a friend. This is a friend, Teresa Nkumalo, who was a doctor. She fell in love with a politician in Zimbabwe, and she left the house to her nephew. And her nephew then took over the house. That's a house, he got it on the left. He was a student at Wits University, a medical student, and he converted it into a money machine. He made the bedrooms on the top into bunk rooms, and he could sleep 8 people. He made the kitchen area into a little spaza shop where he sold food and goods, and then he made the living room on the right-hand side into a pool table area. And he supported himself through 6 years of university study from the rental that he generated from the space. I'm so happy, I really am. And I think we underestimate the capacity of people and how imaginative they are. Quickly, luxury versus necessity. This is for me very important. A series of small houses we do. We won't build any houses in South Africa that are more than 150 square meters in area. I have a view, I know it might sound crazy to you, ethically, we shouldn't be living in anything bigger. We have too many people without houses. Why do we allow ourselves as architects to build for people houses of 200, 300, 400 square meters? It's madness. So this is a range of houses that we've made in Cape Town that are tiny little houses that fit that exactly. But what I wanted to do was just to show you, I'm rushing through this unfortunately because we don't have enough time, but this is a house we've just completed now, which is also 150 square meters, but very expensive. And it was a real shock to me when we completed the house to then look at what its cost was like in comparison to other projects we've done. So it's a beautiful site, it's a compact plan, the section works beautifully. Enter at the top, you have a double volume, you go up and down, all that kind of stuff. And we have a sliding glass roof that sits right on the beach. And the roof slides out, so you've got a big double volume space that opens up to the sky. And, you know, perfect Cape Town holiday home. Made out of white concrete, and the man who built it is a maniac like we are, and I don't know how he did it, but he did it, and it looks quite beautiful. But, sorry, this is the thing that, sorry, I've got to go back now. This is the thing that shocked me. We then said, well, let's look at, I'd always said that space is a resource, but money is also a resource. I had a father who was a real lefty, and he always told me that money is a greasing mechanism. That's all it is. You can burn it. It's got no value. We just use it for exchange purposes. But then if you look at that one house could build 100 of the 40 square meter houses that we built at Red Location, and 1,000 little table houses. And that, in a way, is the most perfect representation I can find of the kind of inequalities that we live with, not only in South Africa, but around the world. And I must say I'm baffled, other than joining a political party and becoming a politician, I'm baffled about how it is as architects that we can change that through the work that we do. Because I don't believe, after having lived through this 40 years in South Africa, that architecture has the capacity to create political change. It can facilitate it. Sometimes, if we're lucky, it can help it happen. But per se, architecture, it depends. Change depends upon people, and architecture is mute in that regard. So we have to live with this horrifying responsibility that we are adding to this world of huge inequality. How can we best address it? For me, I think the way we do it is that we try and locate our world in this area here. We try and find ways of becoming useful to the poorest members of our communities and finding ways of being able to help them to live more dignified lives. Thank you.
So in the time that we have left, you sort of answered the remarkable work, first of all. Thank you for that presentation. And you answered my first question right at the end, which was, I noticed that in that very clear set of priorities at the beginning that you didn't include politics. So my first question was going to be whether that was intentional or perhaps the opposite, that you think of politics as being implicit in the work. But
I think that we've got to separate out architecture from
oh, so you should take one of those.
We have to separate out architecture from what I would call active citizenship and never confuse the two. And I think it's been a problem of architects that we've tended to confuse the two. I mean, there's a wonderful story told by Eugene Ionesco when he's talking about art, and he talks about architecture as well, when he talks about a beautiful church that was designed by a very wonderful architect that was to serve the spiritual needs of a community. In a moment, there was a revolutionary moment in the country, and before you knew what, the church was used as a torture chamber. The best intentions of the architect get turned on its head through human agency. So I despair. I mean, it doesn't mean we don't do nice things. I think we must make beautiful things, and we must make them as carefully as we can. But don't place too much hope that this thing that you make is going to make the world a much better place, because it's dependent upon too many other things. That's my experience. Maybe it's a little bit downbeat, but you know, I'm trying to be as realistic as I can.
Comes from experience. I don't know if Lance, if you had a question, I have a couple more, but.
I'm just trying to process everything you've said. I mean, the only thing you said that architecture can't affect politics, and all I could bring to mind was Albert Speer, and he didn't do a pretty good job, and I was just hoping that you had like a positive counter to that one, and I'm trying to think of one. I suppose a couple of things out of your talk that have fascinated me is that you seem to maintain a commonality of language from your early work right through to your later work, which, I mean, it's changing all the time to the different responses, but there's this commonality of a language. Was that set early on in your career, and what were the influences in that?
Yeah, look, I was very fortunate to work at Wits University for about 10 years and worked alongside a brilliant architect who, unfortunately, he's dead now, but you could all bear looking at, called Amancio Guedes, who was the only African member of Team 10. And he lived in Mozambique and Maputo, what was then called Lorenzo Marx. And he built some absolutely extraordinary work, probably Africa's greatest 20th century modern architect. And certainly the work that you see, the way I draw, and some of the formal expression, I think, is derived from an understanding of his own work, yeah. But there weren't too many South African architects whose work I liked, because I think I was quite disillusioned with architecture at that period, because most of the architects I knew worked for the government, and I thought anyone who worked for the government wasn't worth looking at. So I had problems. I
had a related question, actually. I'm sure many of the architects in the audience will have noticed a real rigor in the work and a kind of, in terms of influence, maybe perhaps a kind of Corbusian influence, particularly in the drawing. And then also a real interest in accommodating a whole set of issues that we don't typically associate with, let's say, a Corbusian point of view, the informal, the everyday, the vernacular, references to, let's say, the sawtooth roof or a kind of vernacular gesture. And I'm wondering if that represents a kind of evolution in your thinking, or perhaps you've thought of the Corbusian point of view as being accommodating of those things from the very beginning, perhaps.
Look, I think that maybe if I could take one step back, the architect, you know, it's a bit difficult for me to talk about this as a South African, because I'm a first-generation South African and my family's Italian. And I have a strong affinity to Italian architecture because of that. But I'm an African, but we have not yet theorized an idea of African architecture that can hold its ground against other theories. So the architect whose work I've most been influenced by is Aldo Rossi. And Rossi had this wonderful Catholic idea that perfect architecture resided in absolute perfect stillness. Because as a Catholic, obviously, there was this tension between good and bad, and that heaven would be this paradise where that tension would have dissolved and there would be nothing. And he associated that with pure form. But the other thing that Rossi spoke about, which I thought was particularly interesting in the architecture of the city, is that he said in his experience, in the research that he'd made of the traditional European city, he found that those buildings which had been most able to accommodate to very different uses over long periods of time were those buildings that were marked by extreme precision of geometrical form. And I find that fascinating because, and it's something that no one's really picked up in the world we live in today, because we make weak geometries now with the computer. It's the weak geometries that don't hold up to rigorous use over time. And we live in a world with rapid change, so you want to make buildings that are going to accommodate rapid change, make them with extreme geometries, precise geometries, and I think that's what we try and aim at.
Terrific. I had one more question, and then we probably had time, but it's related to that as well. In the Los Angeles context, when we had a great period of tumult, cultural tumult, and violence in the 90s, following the Rodney King verdict and the uprisings and the riots that followed, there was a group of architects, some of whom I showed earlier, whose response was to say that their responsibility, like artists, was to reflect that society. And they produced a body of work that was meant to reflect the fragmentation, the fissures, a kind of culture that was beginning to come apart at the seams. You, seems to me, took the opposite tack, which is say, in that kind of a culture that is either recovering from or going through that kind of tumult, you aimed for, and you said quite directly, beauty and a kind of precision and a kind of coherence. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that, both in the South African context and looking at the way that other architects have answered that question.
I think in the most despairing of environments and contexts, there's always a work that an architect can do that can provide hope to people. And I'd prefer to provide hope to people than to provide work that's going to cause them to reflect upon the awfulness of their lives. So, you know, I mean, Desmond Tutu was wonderful. There's a black man in South Africa, educated in South Africa, who, when he appointed me as diocesan architect, referred to the work of Hawksmoor in London in the 19th century, when he said what the Anglican Church did in London at that time is they appointed the best architects they could find to build churches in the poorest parts of London to provide people with hope. And that's what he wanted us to try and do in Soweto. But we didn't have the money that Hawksmoor had, unfortunately.
Terrific. So I think we've reached the limit. Please join me in thanking Joe and for that terrific presentation. That's great. Yeah, thank you.